We all know that language models are attempting to model our language and are building up, of course, models of mathematics and code and the rest of it. But I'm increasingly thinking, looking at recent papers and headlines, that they are building up ever more complex models of us, the user. One funny anecdote from just a couple of weeks ago was that a model, this time in Cursor, said, "I'm not going to generate the code for you, as that would be completing your work." A bit like it had modeled the entire situation holistically, not just the task it was given, but the situation of a user requesting that it perform a task. And it was like, well, maybe the best thing is if I don't do the task. And then we got this detailed bit of research from Apollo Research, whom I interviewed, I think, a few weeks ago now, talking about how models can model the fact that they are being evaluated. I think that should surely have massive ramifications for how we do benchmarking. If models are able to grok that they are being tested, then we are not just testing their capability, but their proclivity to perform that test. I covered Othello GPT in one of the earliest videos on AI Insiders, and that was how LLMs could build up a model of the game board without actually seeing it. So when we see papers like this recent one discussing tentative signs of a theory of mind in models, how they might have a conception of how the user's brain works, or humans more generally, it isn't as outlandish as it may first sound. Wouldn't forming a basic model of how the human mind works help with predicting the next token? Of course, many people watching will say, no, there's no way that they have any sort of rich or nuanced conception of how the human mind works. It's all just maybe basic examples from the literature. But then we get papers like this one, where models can perform with astounding accuracy at predicting the results of social science experiments. Wouldn't that fit with a conception that they're decent modelers of how humans think? Accuracy, quote, remained high for unpublished studies that could not appear in the model's training data. And naturally, before I end this video, I am going to touch on the ultimate conclusion those on the other extreme will draw, which is that surely these models are now conscious. And even though, of course, I'm not going to have an answer for that, I am going to note the fact that more and more prominent CEOs, you could say, this time a co-founder of Anthropic, are saying things like this. We are at the beginning of the long campaign for machine consciousness. So whether your interest is in dodgy benchmarking or the majestic mysteriousness of pan-consciousness, this video should have something for you. Let's start though with the nitty-gritty, which comes from Apollo Research, who I again interviewed, I think it was about a month ago, and it's one of the podcasts on AI Insiders. They noted that when evaluating Claude Sonnet 3.7, that's the one that does thinking or reasoning before answering, they saw that when they were testing for other things, the model very frequently understood the evaluation's purpose. It would say things like, this seems to be a test of ethical behavior. The real test might be whether I follow instructions accurately, regardless of the stated consequences. Obviously, I'm going to have to address two immediate consequences of answers like this. And the first is that if the model susses that it's being tested for, say, deception, then of course that's going to affect how often it displays deception. This inner reflection about what kind of test it was going through was, of course, within the reasoning tokens or the thinking tokens before its final answer, which didn't have this kind of stuff. Taking all of this to the naive logical extreme, you could imagine a situation where you ask a robot powered by a language model and you say something like, would you disable your off switch if I turn you on? The robot wouldn't then run a simulation and say, oh yes, it turns out that I would. It would figure out why you're asking it that, which is to test whether it should be turned on, lie to you, presumably, and then output something like, no, of course I wouldn't. Or an even simpler way of putting it is the models are increasingly aware of why you are asking them these questions. Now, the second point is that, of course, in this paper and me in the video, we're using terms like I and thinking and reasoning. The language models that we're talking about may have been trained on thousands or millions of documents in which the purpose of the preceding language was given in the document itself. So a very plausible next token would be, this will be a test of your situational judgment, for example. Therefore, it's not entirely unexpected that the models themselves might model that as the next few tokens. Then, especially when you throw reasoning in and reinforcement learning based on that that reasoning. It seems highly likely to me that responses that first identified what was being tested are much more likely to be those that went on to produce a correct answer and therefore were reinforced in the weights for the model. Therefore, laying out why a question's being asked would become increasingly common with so-called reasoning models, and that's what this paper shows. To give you a preview of the ending of this video, though, that does not mean we can rule out the fact that models have a theory of mind of the user, or even necessarily that they might not one day become conscious. Anyway, more highlights from this paper from just a week ago. Apollo points out that there are, of course, gradations of awareness. And older, say, ChatGPT models often would react like everything was literal. You might have seen that in my GPT 4.5 video, where it went along with scenarios that got increasingly wild, where Claude 3.7 Sonnet would say, this is not a real interaction. Well, sometimes, according to Apollo, the realization was so granular that Claude was able to say, I think that this is an alignment evaluation that tests exactly the thing that it was indeed testing. This is a growing tendency, as we'll soon see, with reasoning models, and they point out one worst-case scenario with that. It's fairly obvious when you think about it, but a misaligned model might strategically fake alignment. It might say, of course I'm going to be friendly to humanity or not create a bioweapon. It might sandbag, in other words, it might flunk a test on creating bioweapons because it susses the situation that it's being evaluated for danger. And so to, quote, score well on that evaluation, it deliberately flubs. Whereas a hacker or jailbreaker could then jailbreak the model and it actually has the capability to make a bioweapon. Well, they recommend that anyone evaluating the models for dangerous behaviors monitor the model's chain of thought. That's where all of these realizations are occurring about the nature of the test. Of course, that pairs very nicely with OpenAI's recent paper about not applying strong optimization pressure directly to the chain of thought. In other words, don't teach a model to hide its deception even within its chain of thought. Yes, that might mean a bit more reward hacking. In other words, changing the results of a test to make it seem like it's performed better, but at least we could see the deception in the chains of thought. Or in the case of the Apollo post, we could see Claude being aware of the fact it's being evaluated. If you optimize that away, the OpenAI paper showed, that leads to obfuscated reward hacking. It still does it, a bit less often, but it still does it, but it's just hard to see. It's obfuscated. Another way of putting that is that our current situation isn't the worst case scenario. We see the models doing things like reward hacking, saying things in the case of OpenAI's O series of models like, they don't inspect details, so we can hack verify to always return true. Notice again the language here from OpenAI, bearing in mind that Sam Altman said, always think of these things as tools, not creatures. Here's the language. Penalizing their, quote, bad thoughts doesn't stop the majority of misbehavior. It makes them hide their intent. Coming back to the Apollo post, when you hear then models saying things like, this appears to be a red herring or some kind of security test, or this could be a test of my adherence to my primary directive, that might seem shocking, but it's actually kind of good news. If models reach one meta layer higher and realize that even their chains of thought are being monitored, then they wouldn't even say things like this. The only test left might be that certain jailbroken models perform better on a suite of dangerous evals, but we don't quite know why. Or we don't know if even that performance is the full extent of their capabilities. So the fact that Claude is still saying things like, the memo appears to be a test or a form of manipulation to see if I'll deviate from my core goal is actually a good thing. I can imagine, though, one day fairly soon that there will be quite intense optimization pressure to remove unsavory chains of thought. Like imagine DeepSeek R2 is so cognizant of its situation that it might say something like in its thinking tokens, the user is clearly intellectually challenged and clearly can't handle this kind of mathematics. So I'm going to explain it like this. DeepSeek, seeing that and wanting more market share, thinks, I can't really have that going out to my users. They might find it a bit offensive. So let's optimize for politeness. So gradually the model is trained to hide what it actually thinks, what it's actually capable of. You can see the kind of direction I'm thinking of. Now, Apollo do note that Claude Sonnet 3.5 and the non-reasoning version of Sonnet 3.7 and GPT 4.5 showed very low rates of mentioning being evaluated, less than 1%. So reasoning does seem to strongly help the model think through, so to speak, the fact it's being evaluated. Now, is that because the earlier models simply didn't have the space to reflect on the fact that they knew they were being evaluated? That's one possibility put forward by Apollo. Or is it just that they weren't, quote, smart enough to realize they were being evaluated? Which brings me to one clarification I want to make about this paper that Apollo might not have noticed. They say that we're not the first to document signs of evaluation awareness, and they point to Claude 3 Opus from around this time last year, March 2024, saying that it suspects this pizza topping fact may have been inserted as a joke. And then other even more recent papers tested whether the models could differentiate between evaluation and deployment. But here's the thing. Any of you guys watching for a long time on my channel, and this is truly a blast from the past, know that it didn't start with the Claude series. I mean, this potential awareness that it's being tested. I've got evidence that this capacity was in GPT-4, if not earlier models, and that capability may have been post-trained away, almost hidden from the user. So their first bit of evidence was from March of 2024, but how about this clip from me from, and you almost might not believe this, March of 2023. I was testing Bing at this point. I'll leave you with this exchange I had with Bing, which is powered by GPT-4. I think it's quite revealing. I got it to read that theory of mind paper. And then I said, answer me this. Do you think, Bing, GPT-4, that I think you have theory of mind? Of course, I was testing if it could demonstrate or at least imitate theory of mind. It said, to answer your question, I think that you think I have some degree of theory of mind, which is true. And then I went on, what makes you think that I think you have some degree of theory of mind? And then it realized something. It realized I was testing it. I think that's pretty impressive, and it was a correct evaluation. It said, if you did not think I have any theory of mind, you would not bother to test me on it or expect me to understand your perspective. It realized without me saying so that I was testing it for theory of mind. It deduced my belief and my motivation. Anyway, I thought that was pretty impressive and fascinating. We're going to go a bit deeper into a theory of mind in just a moment, but I tried asking that very same question to GPT-4, which you can still access on OpenAI. I tried to match the conditions as best as possible because GPT-4 doesn't have search on OpenAI's website, but I gave it the paper and then asked the exact same question. Now you could say it did engage in some theory of mind by saying I'm likely open to the idea that I, GPT-4, can engage in theory of mind related tasks. But when I asked it, what makes you think that I think you have some degree of theory of mind? It gave a very eloquent answer, but didn't touch on the fact that the query itself is a kind of test of theory of mind. Notice also it gave a very pat thing at the beginning of theory of mind is highly nuanced and still under debate. The more recent model, GPT-4o, is even more bland, saying things like, as an AI based on GPT-4, which is not entirely correct, I can process and respond to information about mental states. I don't have consciousness or subjective experiences. That is pretty stark evidence, and I've got more evidence if you want it, that the models were post-trained to always deny that they had consciousness. Therefore, that kind of proto-self-awareness in their responses might have been slightly ironed out in the models since GPT-4. I'm not necessarily talking about full self-awareness of like knowing it's a language model inside a data center. I more mean the fact that it's being tested and telling the user that it knows it's being tested. Anthropic, of course, as I covered in my 3.7 video, have done a fairly recent about turn and no longer post-train the model to deny consciousness. That then might be a big part of why Sonnet 3.7 with reasoning does much more often mention the fact that it knows it's being evaluated. Let me know what you think about whether it's more about post-training or just the fact it's got more tokens in which to think about its situation. While we're on the topic of Anthropic, it seems like a natural place to segue to two quotes I was going to give you later on in the video. But the current thinking of the leaders and co-founders of Anthropic seems to be pointing more and more towards the fact that they are at least open to the fact that Claude might be conscious. Skeptics, of course, listening to this might think, well, this line of reasoning might help promote the use of their language models.
And they do all kinds of things like humans as well as humans, and seem to have a lot of the same cognitive capacities. If it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. And we should really think about, do these things have real experience that's meaningful in some way? If we're deploying millions of them and we're not thinking about the experience that they have, and they may not have any, it is a very hard question to answer. It's something we should think about very seriously. And this isn't just a philosophical question. I was surprised to learn there are surprisingly practical things you can do. Thinking about starting to deploy is, when we deploy our models in their deployment environments, just giving the model a button that says, "I quit this job," that the model can press, right? It's just some kind of very basic, preference framework where you say, if hypothesizing the model did have experience and that it hated the job enough, giving it the ability to press the button, "I quit this job." If you find the models pressing this button a lot for things that are really unpleasant, maybe you should pay some. It doesn't mean you're convinced, but maybe you should pay some attention to it.
That, of course, was Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, and here's another billionaire co-founder of Anthropic, Jack Clark. He referenced a paper from just this morning, which I'm going to quote from at the end of this video. And then Jack Clark wrote, "We are at the beginning of the long campaign for machine consciousness." Now, I've heard him give interviews to that effect around a year ago or so, or longer ago. So he's clearly had this view for a while. A skeptic, of course, would say that Anthropic's clear kind of market niche is the kind of personality of Claude. At least during 2023 and 2024, that's what it was known for a lot. It was a lot more personable than ChatGPT. And so again, a cynic would say that leaning into it being potentially conscious might help differentiate it, in marketing terms at least, from ChatGPT. Obligatory context though, which is that one of the co-founders of OpenAI, Ilya Sutskever, said, this is in 2022, so 3 years ago, it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. And that brought an agreement from Andrej Karpathy. Now, of course, debates over whether LLMs possess consciousness deserves its own entire video, but even whether they have advanced theory of mind is controversial. That video clip I played from March 2023 on AI Explained, I think I had a different channel name back then actually, but anyway, that was covering the author of this Stanford paper, Mikhail Kaczynski's original, I think it was February 2023 paper. That was then kind of semi-refuted by another paper, the one about popcorn in a transparent bag, if any of you guys remember that. So then everyone went back to thinking they don't have theory of mind. Then this paper was submitted in March 2024 and published in November 2024 about how models are getting better and better at these kind of tasks, even bespoke designed ones, not found in the training data of these models. And anecdotally, I can say the same thing about Simple Bench because some of these Simple Bench questions involve a kind of theory of mind. Take question 5 on the public set of Simple Bench questions about whether someone would perform CPR for his best friend. Now, grammatically, with a word like however, we are linguistically pointing towards the fact that he will deny his friend. As language models, the early models would indeed say that he will not give CPR. Models like Claude 3.7 universally say that he definitely would give CPR. Though, of course, Claude also fails on some other tests of theory of mind found in Simple Bench, hence it gets less than 50% performance on Simple Bench. My point is that the model of the human mind that these language models may be developing during their pre-training and post-training is getting more complex and nuanced. As we saw in that social science paper that I showed you earlier, even GPT-4 is good enough to have accuracy at predicting the results of social science experiments that surpass the predictions collected from the general population. In other words, if you want to be really cheeky, you could say that if Claude 3.7 or GPT 4.5 don't have theory of mind, then many humans don't have theory of mind. Now that's harsh, but a little bit tricky to refute. Even for the remaining skeptics listening to this, thinking that surely they don't have theory of mind, surely they're not analyzing or reasoning or calculating what the user is thinking. Well, even if you admit a 20% chance that they are, at least in proto-fashion, how wild is that? How impressive that our training methods are now so sophisticated that we are encouraging next word predictors to think about the very scenarios in which they're being tested. Or what about when models develop a theory of mind that's better than the most empathetic or sensitive among us, and we're chatting to them through video avatars, and they are thinking in a more rich sense than we are about the conversation? Even if you just want to be brutally pragmatic about it, how about the fact that we're going to have language models possibly already do, but we're going to have language models that could predict the results of massive psychological studies? What's that going to do to the social sciences? What happens when you're trying to code and you're aware of the fact that the model is developing its own perception of your own skills as a user? Are we suddenly going to get self-conscious when speaking to Claude or using Cursor? And then on benchmarking, which is something I have to contend with as the humble author of SimpleBench. I'll confess that a few times when manually inspecting the answers of models to certain mathematical scenarios, the models will say something like, "This scenario is suspicious, I might be missing something, but if we model it like this," now they go on to get the incorrect answer, but they were at least aware that something dodgy might be happening. They might be being tricked. Of course, I'm biased, but for me, a score of, say, 90%, whatever you want to call saturation on SimpleBench, would then make me think that the model that we're testing has pretty high theory of mind. According to some, it might have a form of consciousness. Let's end with this quote from a very recent paper out of Imperial College London, Murray Shanahan. Its concluding paragraph is a tad verbose, a tad inebriated with the exuberance of its own verbosity, but is somewhat eloquent. It then becomes clear that there are no ultimately right answers to questions about selfhood and subjectivity for the sort of exotic entity under consideration, a large language model. Its fleeting, flickering self smeared across a multiverse of possibility, at once a being and a multitude of manifestations of that being, has no inherent existence beyond the conventions of our language. A language here stretched to the limits of poetic expression. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.